DevilSec. We are a hacking club, red team, blue team. We actually teach from the ground up, so if you don't know what Linux is, we'll go ahead and start teaching you Linux, anything like that. If you want to get into hacking and just don't know where to start, we have industry professionals working in the club with us, so we actually will be able to provide that good industry knowledge and experience. We have a website, DevilSec.club. You can go ahead and join our Discord, which is technically our mailing list. We don't really have a mailing list. Behind, so I'm not maybe. But Discord is how we talk to everything. If you guys want to do that, hit me up after the club, and we'll be talking for a little bit after the meeting as well. Just want to feel free to network around. Totally good. But yeah, so we have Bishop Fox here, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves. So.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I'm a recruiter at Bishop Fox. I've been with the company for about 2 years. Mike and I are both ASU alumni, so we're both a little bit biased, and we're really excited to kind of come out and to see all the hard work that all of the officers at DevilSec have been doing to build up the club. It's been great kind of getting to know some of them in the professional space, and really excited to keep growing the relationship with DevilSec this year. If any of you find that you're like, you love this talk, you love what's going on in the club, your focus is really on offensive security, that's what we do. So if you're hoping to be on a blue team, I can talk to you about other companies that have really great blue teams that you'd love to work for, but if you're hoping to be on a red team, then that's actually in our wheelhouse. So as a recruiter, I run all the university programs, so if you find yourself looking for an internship or for something full-time afterwards, I could be the person who looks at your resume, so don't get mad at me if you've submitted one before. We take a really small number of interns, so it's really kind of cyclical in terms of what's open and when it's open. But always excited to chat resumes and connect and see if maybe there's a space down the road. I hope that wasn't too long. So feel free to come talk to me afterwards.
All right. Before I get started talking about myself a little bit, I'm unfamiliar with most of you guys, so just a couple survey questions. In terms of my audience that I'm talking to, how many of you are like on a red team track? I want to be a penetration tester, ethical hacker, whatever else you want to call that. This group over here. How about like blue team folks? Do you want to be the defenders of security systems, cyber defense, that sort of thing? Nobody wants to admit to that. And then everybody else, general like CS, just a passing interest in security.
There's a lot of people exploring.
Cool. Also, survey question: was anybody at the 2018 symposium in October and saw me talk at you before? This guy. Fun fact about that: the day before I did that presentation, I shaved the mohawk off. And so I had no hair, so I look pretty different. This has been growing exactly since then. So the length of my mullet is really kind of a time indicator for time in between ASU presentations. I'll be keeping it for a couple more months until I ruin my sister's wedding pictures by having this sweet mullet in it. So back to more of the relevant stuff for this presentation. I got a bachelor's degree in computer systems engineering from ASU. Go Devils. Also, from there, I took a little bit of a detour. I came back to ASU and went into teaching for a little bit. That was pretty short-lived, and I went back into IT. So I have 12 years of application testing experience across kind of a variety of forms of application testing. And I did some secure code review for Wells Fargo for a little bit. That was just only reading source code. And then I wanted to actually get my hands on things and watch them break. So I moved over to Bishop Fox 7 years ago, where I started as a penetration tester. So I was mostly hacking web applications, a little bit of networks, mobile apps, other things like that. And now I've moved into a management role at Bishop Fox. So my primary interest now is helping other people grow their information security careers, helping people get better at penetration testing, and also just trying to define standards for what good security consulting looks like. So that's what I'm up to these days. I wanted to caveat at the beginning of this, a thing that bothers me about the security a little bit is it's kind of a cool thing to be a hacker and thought leader and expert and things like that. So a lot of people seem more interested in that aspect than actually doing the work and securing things or all of that. Other people also like to just make bold proclamations about what is the absolute answer for how to do things and things like that. And there isn't a lot of good data to have that firm of a position on any of the security things. So this is my disclaimer that the things I'm going to talk about is my experience. There's a benefit to having been in consulting where I get to see different industries, different size companies, different levels of maturity, different levels of investment in technology, different frameworks and things. So it does go fairly broad, but we're still talking about just one guy and one experience. So your mileage may vary. So getting into talking about security just overall, where are we at with cybersecurity these days? I just really like this quote as general is about World War II, but to talk about information security, it's very immature. We're at the beginning of it. Everything is just kind of getting started. I know in a lot of security presentations, people will make parallels to physical world security or warfare or martial arts are also common analogies that come up. And a lot of those concepts go way back in time. But in terms of the actual like nuts and bolts of defending web applications on the internet, that's a pretty new concept. I will point out that when I was a child, there was no internet. So I didn't grow up wanting to be a hacker of web applications because that thing didn't exist. I am older than Larry Fitzgerald. So well, that's a running joke in the office actually, because they always talk about how he's at the end of the career and what a like old veteran he is, and he should be done playing football and everything. I'm a couple months older than Larry Fitzgerald is. So I'm at the end. I'm practically dead. So it's a new thing. Everybody's still trying to figure it out. When I went to ASU, I did a bunch of programming projects. None of them had any security concern to them. I didn't take any security classes. Nobody cared about the security of the programming projects that I did. They were all measured on other things. So I didn't really pick any of that up until later, which is kind of an understandable gap. Again, most people didn't start caring until recently. Even if you look at the beginnings of the internet itself, HTTP and the World Wide Web, that was meant for the public sharing of information. The structure of the protocols and all of those things did not take security into account at all. All the security that we've been worried about has been kind of glued on after the fact and kind of duct taped to protocols that were not really meant for the secure sharing of information. And one other anecdote about my age is when I started working at Bishop Fox, one of my younger coworkers, it was actually Drew Porter, was talking about hacking the Wi-Fi at his high school. And I don't remember what my reaction was. I made a face at him or something. And he just goes, "What, you didn't hack the Wi-Fi at your high school?" And I was like, there was no Wi-Fi. I didn't actually get off a dial-up modem until I moved onto campus when I started college at ASU. Before that, it was all the screeching and hissing of a phone line trying to get me on the internet. So we're at the beginning there, and some people are ahead of others, but when I started my career, a lot of other people hadn't considered security at all. My first job, I was given the opportunity to read the Web Application Hacker's Handbook. I always hype that book. It's basically the reason my career took this direction. I was doing other forms of software testing. I read the Web Application Hacker's Handbook and I went, oh man, you can do that? I want to do that. And so that's what got me into web application security specifically. And despite not having any experience at it, they let me just kind of go nuts and do some security testing of internal applications for the organization that I was working at. And I found all kinds of stuff. It was just falling out all over the place. Cross-site scripting everywhere, SQL injection everywhere. There's no authorization controls. I can take over all kinds of things. And I wasn't good. To be clear, this is not me bragging about being an awesome hacker. I had just started hacking. The problem was that nobody else had ever given that level of concern about security for the applications that I was looking at. Nobody had tried to test those in that way, or at least not within the organization. I don't know what any other randos on the internet might have done to that before I got there, but they weren't doing systematic security reviews of their things, and so then the developers weren't really concerning themselves with the security either. They had other things. They had to add functionality for the business. They had to make sure that the usability scores were good for the end users. They had to make sure that it was performant and everything, but nobody was getting on their case about security, so it just wasn't really there. That was, at the beginning of the 12 years, a little bit more recently than that. 7 years ago, I started doing penetration testing for Bishop Fox. My first engagement there, same sort of thing. I'm still relatively junior as a penetration tester at that point. My first engagement was actually that client's first penetration test. So they had never had anybody do security testing on their thing. And I looked at that, same sort of deal. The OWASP top 10 basically just fell out of it. I got a shell in the box and everything was all falling apart. And again, this is only 7 years ago, and we're talking about that's when people started trying. so from that point, the beginning of trying, 7 years ago, there are a lot of problems that need to be solved, and it's kind of understandable when you look at it through that lens why they haven't all been solved at this point. It's such a new problem, really. So what I plan to talk about from this point forward is a little bit of what did it look like 7 years ago when I started breaking things. What does it look like now? So before I go into any of that further, I'll also just add that if anybody has questions or things during the presentation, go ahead and wave at me, and we can talk about whatever that is. No thing in the planned presentation is so precious that we can't take an interesting detour on a subject that's more meaningful to you guys. I wrote the presentation not knowing you guys, so if there's a better way to take it, we can do that. So organizations are still at all levels of maturity. We have some clients that are super security paranoid, and they have a staff of really well-qualified security people working in-house, and then they still contract us out just to get another third-party set of eyes on things to make sure that they didn't miss anything. Some other customers are more reluctantly involved with us. They have maybe compliance pressure that requires them to do security testing, something like PCI, or maybe they're a software vendor and the customers that they sell their product to demand that they get security testing so that they know that they're safe buying this software from them. And sometimes they're a little bit less robust about their security than other places because it's kind of an obligation that they're fulfilling from other people. They haven't still quite internalized the need for it. Maybe they haven't had the incident yet that made people lose their jobs or things, and so they're still kind of holding out a little bit. It's less common these days to encounter somebody that is entirely naive. We've never done anything for security before, but every once in a while those folks still slip in and you go, okay, even though the rest of us started trying 10 years ago, they started trying yesterday. So they got a little bit of catching up to do. The first thing I have, we'll talk through kind of applications, since that's kind of my baby. That part goes a little bit longer than the other sections, but that's the primary service that we do is web application assessments. So they look different than they used to. Back when I started, everything at enterprises was C#.NET, it was Java, some smaller places were using PHP. And now a lot of places have more kind of built for the web, modern languages and frameworks, Ruby on Rails, Node.js, things like that. Another major change in the web application space is kind of the full architecture of applications has changed a lot. And that really comes down to the invention of the iPhone, which again, happened in the middle of my career as opposed to having always been a part of my life. So when that first came out, that changed how everybody consumed content over the internet now with apps and things on phones. So people who had web applications, websites had to make adjustments to that so that it would fit on the phone or it would communicate nicely with the mobile app. And so they started with what the web used to look like, is a big pile of HTML. So the old forms of web applications, like you request a resource and you get just everything back in that one singular request. And then once the iPhone and other things made it necessary, they started creating APIs for the mobile applications to talk to, because it doesn't make sense for the mobile app to try to parse everything out of that big blob of HTML. They created an API on top of that, which is some redundancy of work at that point, where you had this whole web application that has all the functionality, and then they got to recreate that again for the API for the other things to talk to. Now that a lot of things are being born into the world where the mobile devices already exist and all that's a thing, now we're going to the fact where it's all the API. You start with the API, that's all the functionality, and now what was the desktop web view of it? It's just like a JavaScript client of the same API that the mobile devices are talking to when they're doing things. And so that has one consequence of meaning that JavaScript is everywhere now, and you got to know JavaScript, which for an old person like me is sad, because JavaScript is gross and I hate it and it's hard to read, and the event-driven nature of it is weird because it doesn't work like all the rest of the applications do, and then you get callback hell, and it's just a bummer, man. But anyway, we lost that one. So JavaScript appears to be here for a little while. One other impact that this architecture change had on web application testing is security scanners, and that the kind of dumb security scanning tools for web applications were built to address the previous model, where they would expect the full pile of HTML and then parse that, pull links out to crawl the site and things like that. But now if all of the navigation and things are happening based on JavaScript running in the browser, that method doesn't work anymore. If you've tried to use like a crawling tool on like OWASP's Juice Shop, I don't know if anybody's played with that. It's an intentionally vulnerable application for practicing hacking. It doesn't scan well. It doesn't crawl the site very well anymore because of this change in architecture. So now, in order to be able to crawl the site and exercise all the functionality, it has to do the full interpretation of JavaScript like a browser would do, and that's like a significant amount of overhead for security tools, and a lot of those are still lacking in that regard. So that is the architectural change that's kind of happened over the last few years in applications. So altogether, there's progress. The new languages, new frameworks made a lot of security improvements. It's a lot easier to be secure writing code now than it was previously. As a personal anecdote to that, before I got into security, before I read that book that changed everything for me, I wrote CMS for my own personal website. I didn't want to keep uploading HTML files that I edited in a text editor anymore. I wanted an interface to manage the content on my website. I could have used the WordPress or Drupal or something like that, but I wanted actually to just do the programming project of writing my own thing. So I did that. I wrote it in PHP. I thought it was brilliant. It was super simple. The code was readable. It was powerful. It was elegant. And I was like, this is fantastic. It does everything I need. And then eventually when I read that book, I also realized that it had almost every vulnerability possible built into it. Because the easiest way to do things at that time were all super vulnerable. The ways to call the database, the way to display content on the page, the way I stored passwords, but it was all wrong. And so once I started reading the Web Application Hacker's Handbook, I immediately went to my personal website and deleted all of that. And I was like, that was a big mistake. I think now, if I were to do the same project over again, I wouldn't use PHP. But even there, PHP as a language has improved considerably, and there's also frameworks that will help you do things correctly. But If I were to do the same thing again using like Ruby on Rails, I think I could spend the same amount of time coding and nearly the same amount of concern about the security, and it would be a substantially more secure application than the one that I wrote before, almost with no doing on my own end, just because like the default behaviors now are more secure than what default behaviors used to be. That said, frameworks can't do everything for you. So there are still things that developers need to deal with. It's better, but it's not resolved. One kind of debate to how much better it is the problem of the lopsided nature of the challenge, right? In order to like really secure a system of some kind, you basically have to get it all right. You can't have any vulnerabilities in it and then you go, okay, it's secure, it can't be hacked. Playing the game from the other side as a hacker, if you find one good vulnerability, you can hack the thing. And so with the frameworks removing a lot of things, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, you almost have to go out of your way to put those into certain modern apps. And so those are solved for you. But if you still have a high-risk authorization problem or something like that, how much more secure are you really now? Maybe just by pure count of vulnerabilities in your application, it has been reduced. In terms of the overall impact to the organization, that's debatable. Also, I want to point out that I didn't intend to do this when I first started making the slide deck, but once I noticed it happened, I just went with it. That my transition slides are basically all paraphrases of quotes from movies. I might be too old for you guys to know all the references that I'm putting here, but if you could point out that you've got them after the fact, it'll make me feel better. So here's another one. This is my transition into networks and how networks have changed over that time. They were wires and boxes and server rooms, and now they're clouds. So at the beginning of my being a security tester, things were generally on premises. The organizations had their own data centers. They had appliances and switches and routers and all of those things, and they all had to be configured and wired and connected and all of that stuff. And more everybody is putting their stuff now into the cloud. Again, it has a lot of parallels to the framework situation in that it doesn't solve all of your problems, but it makes a lot of them easier to deal with. It offloads a lot of challenging pieces that you would have otherwise had to deal with. A problem that we used to cite fairly regularly when we would do network assessments towards the beginning of my tenure is a lack of network segmentation. You get on somebody's network and you realize that it's entirely flat and that everything that they have can talk to each other. If a regular employee plugs in the office, they can connect to the web servers, they can connect to any other sensitive systems in the back end. The web servers can also connect to everything else. So now you have a huge problem. If any one of these things gets owned, somebody finds a web application vulnerability, they can talk to the whole organization. If somebody that works there gets duped in a social engineering attack, again, that costs them the whole organization. And we would write this up as a finding, and go, this is dangerous that everything can talk to everything, you should change that. And they would go, yeah, we know, we just, we can't do anything about it. Like, it's just such a tremendous amount of stuff that would need to be changed that it's just not feasible for them to make those adjustments. And it's a risk, and we just have to live with it because we built this monumental thing that now can't be easily changed. That's not so much true in the cloud. That's a web interface. You can put things in security groups. You can put firewalls between stuff. This group can't talk to this group. That's a pretty easy change. It will also log changes that you've made to those things. You can have things updated automatically. Things are centralized. It's a significant gain for security to make that move. You're trusting somewhat in Amazon, but at this point, they have most of the internet anyway. So, everybody else does. Another movie quote. as a transition into social engineering. This is the quick summary of how social engineering has gone during my time at Bishop Fox. And when I got there, it was automatic win. We felt guilty about it, like it was unfair that you could just make fake emails, you could make it appear to come from the IT department or somebody's manager or whoever you wanted it to come from. You send it to anybody that you want within their organization. You put either a link to a website that we controlled, or you just put a file in there and say, you need to apply these updates, please do it. And a significant number of people would do it, and then we have access to their machines within their internal network, which we just talked about is probably totally flat. And so now we can access everything in their corporation. It was automatic, it was easy, no problems.
We are genius.
Thank you. That was the movie for the previous transition slide. Or he just thinks I'm really smart. One of those two. So now it's considerably more challenging. There are a lot of things locking down email now. It's harder to send fraudulent emails because people put the appropriate controls on their domains so that you can't just forge emails from anybody that you want to. There are other controls in place that are stopping the emails from ever getting to the user's inbox. And then after that, there are better host-based controls. If you do manage to get the email to them and you get them to open it, that will prevent things contained in that email from then executing on their machine. So that's not to say that there aren't ways around that or that people aren't still gullible. They're totally still gullible, but fortunately the technological controls get in their way a lot more than they used to. So now social engineering has become more of a challenge. And so we're kind of revamping our tools and approaches in order to continue success for social engineering, but we have to work at it now. So this is my introduction to the Internet of Things. There used to be computers, and then computers got the internet, and then phones got the internet, and now toasters have the internet. And that has consequences. So the before and after is candles without internet connectivity, and now smart forks. Those are both real, by the way. I didn't make up either of those. As dumb as they sound, both of those things exist. We were just talking about that in an internal company chat with those smart candles, that you can remotely ignite a candle. No, stop it. That's bad. Yes, thank you. It was. Okay, so this actually, besides the comedy of setting things on fire remotely with candles for some reason, this brings us to hardware interest. So up until Internet of Things really took off, we didn't engage in a lot of hardware hacking, but now that everybody's packing the internet into some box that lives in your home, we're doing a lot more taking apart actual physical devices. Probably the more interesting stuff is home security, home automation systems, things that connect to your house and you're hoping are keeping you safer rather than making you more vulnerable. But there's a lot of other things like just the weird other dumb ideas. And so now this brings in soldering irons and cables and wires and things that we hadn't been into before. That's not really a space that I'm personally into very much, but that's a thing that Bishop Fox is definitely getting more and more into. One other anecdote about Internet of Things. We had a debate in the office a while back. Somebody was talking about the Internet of Things and said, you would add 100 features to a smart fridge before anybody ever thought of security. And we did our best to see if that was true. So we listed out features on the whiteboard behind us and tried to come up with as many features as we could add to a smart fridge and see if we could get 100 of them before we mentioned security. And it turned out we couldn't. It got pretty ludicrous. We had like a garden was somehow built into the refrigerator, and there was also like an incinerator and maybe a dishwasher or two or something. It got like really out of hand, and we still stalled out somewhere in the 90s. So having gone through that exercise, I just want to say that security is definitely a top 100 feature of a smart fridge. And so kind of what I've talked about so far is the systems that we're testing, the things that our clients are up to. And so I just want to go a little bit into talking about like what is the nature of our testing look like, how has that gone over the last few years. So the short version of testing is we still need a lot more hackers. There aren't enough people to fulfill all the need in the security space. So the general perspective of Bishop Fox is that we're not worried about competition in the security space as much as scaling ourselves. And so that's not like hubris or like, oh, we're so awesome, we don't have to worry about what anybody else is doing. It's just the kind of the math of the reality that us plus our competition can't fulfill all of the need to do security right now. So we need to figure out how to do more of it without losing quality or kind of tripping over ourselves as we try to get larger. So one solution that...
was the hackathon from the movie Hackers?
Yes, it was. We're doing better than I thought. Thank you, guys. An answer that comes up a lot whenever you're talking about scaling things is we got to go to automation. And like, let's use automation. We don't have enough people. Let's go to automation. And my perspective of automation is that we're a long way away from that being like a viable replacement for having more people. It's just not very good is the short of it. That automated tools don't do security very well. It's a complicated thing. It involves a lot of context. And that's not to say that it won't eventually get there. Even within our firm, we're working on automated solutions to try to do that. But in terms of being a replacement for smart hackers doing the security work, it's a long way off. So like tools are good and useful. I generally consider the best security tools at this point are like a nail gun is to a hammer. Like it's better, it's faster than using the hammer, but it's not going to frame a house. You still need a dude to put the nails in the right place, even if he's using the superior tool. So we have some better tooling now, but it still needs to be wielded by the clever guy who's using it and not just set and run. And not everybody entirely accepts that. That is the reality. We see both clients and competitors kind of get confused over the value of the output of tools. That they see a tool says that these are problems, so they're problems. No, man, those aren't real. Like it's not a real problem. And we will run some of them almost as a CYA just to make sure that the tool didn't see something that we didn't, but a lot of the time it's just a matter of sorting through false positives and things like that. And particularly bad are the static analysis tools. I've used a few of them, Checkmarks, Fortify, Breakman, Rips. It's a lot more misses than hits, and you find yourself kind of going through a lot of problems that either aren't real problems or they're missing the real problems and things like that. And as far as source code review goes, me and most of the people that I work with tend to use grep. More so than any of the other tools. You grep the code for things that you're looking for. Maybe you just read sections of it yourself to understand it. But the tools that just automatically go through and tell you what the security problems are, they do it very, very poorly. So we're a long way from automation being the answer that moves people out of security jobs. For the one guy that admitted to being a blue team person, that's also true on the defensive side. So we'll see sometimes people that believe in the magic boxes for defense, that if you have application problems that you can put a web application firewall and that'll block all the things and then your application is safe. And those are bad for all the same reasons that the offensive tools are bad, that they just don't understand the context well enough to block the right things. If you tune it up so far that it's blocking everything, you end up ruining functionality of the application. If you dial it back, then there's workarounds, and then attacks get through. And they have a place, just like the other tools do. If there are certain points where you have a third-party software or something that you need to patch but can't patch it yet, or the patch hasn't been released, you can put a WAF in front of that to block a particular attack pattern that you know of, and you want to block that can be useful. But as just your generalized strategy for avoiding web application attacks. The developers have to fix the code of the app. It's the same way, like they need to be responsible for that in the same way the offensive testers are still needing to be smart people doing the offensive testing. So there's a wide range of skills and abilities for people making their living doing cybersecurity testing. As somebody who interviewed just a ton of people in the end of Q4, there were a lot of people who had many years of experience that just were not very good at it. And so this is a problem for our clients and us also. For the clients, it's hard to evaluate how do we know if somebody's good at security? How do we hire a security? If I'm not a security expert, how do I identify a security expert? And so some of it, they are just doing trial and error with things. They hire one security firm and they get some results from it, and then they look at those results and go, okay, we'll do it again with another security firm and see which one feels better, and go by that. And sometimes, again, they get it wrong in terms of going by the count of vulnerabilities found. And the one guy just reports the full output of the tools, and it says that they found 300 vulnerabilities. And they're like, oh, that guy found 300. He's really good. But if they're not real consequential findings, then that's not really helping anybody. And that's not just on them. As an industry, people working in security, we don't have a great definition of what good testing looks like, or like how to define good testing. There are several standards out there. There's like the OWASP, ASV. I feel like I'm missing a letter, but something like that. There's the pen test execution standard. But they all kind of struggle with a problem in that they kind of work into being what's effectively a checklist for doing security testing. And the problem with getting a checklist for security testing is getting the right level of granularity to it. So it seems like a good idea. Other industries use checklists. Airline pilots, brain surgeons use checklists, and they've actually proven to save lives in both of those cases. But the difference between one application test to the next and different frameworks and things like that, they vary so widely that it gets hard to have a checklist that is relevant to all of those different cases. So the problem is if you try to be exhaustive and you're creating the checklist for the reason that you don't want to miss anything, you want to make sure all necessary points are covered. If you do that, then for most assessments you do, most of the checklist is going to be unhelpful. You go, this functionality doesn't apply, this one doesn't apply, this one doesn't apply, and so you're looking at this checklist, and every time you look at the checklist, you throw half of it out because it doesn't apply to the situation that you're looking at. You go, if there's a whole section on XML parsing vulnerabilities and this app doesn't even touch XML, then that section is kind of useless. And so you get in the habit of throwing that out, and then you go, why am I using this checklist anyway? It's mostly stuff that doesn't even apply to me. And so then you get rid of it. So then kind of the counter proposal to that version of the checklist problem is to steer in the other direction. We go, let's make it general so that it applies all the time. You need to check for auth controls, you need to look for injection flaws, make sure the cryptography is used appropriately. And yes, now you don't have to throw the checklist out every time that you're looking at it, but now the act of checking off one of those boxes is considerably less meaningful than the more granular version, right? If I say, I checked for injection flaws, like that's a really broad category. It depends on what sort of interpreter that data is going to. Is that going to the command line? Are we talking about SQL injection? Are we talking about cross-site scripting, which is really an injection flaw, whether or not OWASP Top 10 admits that? And so now you can't really evaluate the quality of that testing if you've checked off a checklist that is like overly broad. I don't have a real answer to that. I entirely agree with the aim of the standards and checklists. You want testing to be more traceable, measurable, repeatable, so that we can determine if we are doing what we should be doing, determine if things are getting better, and if you don't have a way to kind of consolidate that, that's hard to do. So I'm with the standards in terms of the spirit of them and their aims. We just haven't found a way to really make it stick in a way that is regularly usable. So from our end, we generally are resolving this problem with more people. So you have an expert tester, somebody that we've established and trusted as a great hacker, and have them work with more junior people and either help mentor them up or kind of evaluate the quality of their work. The problem with that is that just doesn't scale. If we have only a few experts to go around, they can't work with everybody and evaluate everybody. How do we know everybody across the board is doing what they need to do? And that's one of the challenges that we're trying to figure out. So this is getting to the conclusion of it. Security is neither solved nor doomed. I don't think that everything's on fire. I'm not like one of those naysayers. I still do online banking, online shopping, things like that. I don't like live in a panic attack that all my information is going to be stolen, or that somebody's going to get into the Whopper and launch nuclear missiles at me. But there are a lot of challenges that we do need to figure out. There are going to continue to be incidents, and it's going to like get in the way of us doing fun, cool things on the internet until we make more progress in security. So I think the challenges will be fun and interesting, and I hope a lot of you guys will be interested in joining to take them on, because as I said before, we need more help. So a couple of references here. I didn't actually name it earlier, but when I was talking about the web being built out of things that don't have security in mind, The Tangled Web is a really fantastic book about like where all the protocols and functions of the internet came from and why they're such a tangled web of mess that they are. And I had a lot more sympathy for the developers of web browsers when I read that. I know everybody likes to give people grief, especially like Internet Explorer. They're like, it doesn't follow standards and things like that. Actually, when you read the Tangled Web, you realize it's impossible. The standards are written in such a way that you cannot make sense of them. Some of them contradict themselves, and people did the best they could to try to make things work. And a lot of that has a lot of security consequences to it. And then for anybody that was playing but didn't get all of them, this was actually the order of the movie references. Started with The Big Lebowski, threw in a Good Burger, and then Rambo, Real Genius, Jurassic Park, and Hackers.
I've seen Rambo like 7 times. How did I not get that one?
It was a really simple one. That was Nothing Is Over, which he yells in the police station at the end of the movie.
What was the Good Burger one?
Oh, I'm a noob, she's a noob. We're all noobs, hey. This is your Good Burger reference for the day.
Anybody have any questions? Comments? Concerns maybe?
Like for all of us as students, what would you recommend we do besides doing CTFs and joining big clubs? Like, how could we prepare to enter the field?
First things first, in terms of application security in general, I think just building stuff and understanding how things work, that to me is like the 99, or the not 99, 90% of the important knowledge to have, or most useful knowledge. And then like the technical security details is just the polish on top of that, really. I think it's easier to take somebody who has like a really solid understanding of how applications work, and then just explain to them, these are anti-patterns, this is what is bad in a security context, versus you could have an idea or be able to describe the vulnerabilities, but if you don't fundamentally, if you can't read code, if you don't fundamentally understand how the things are put together, then it's much harder to take them apart. And that part takes much longer, I think, to scale up on. So if I were going to kind of focus on one thing, I think it just like a generally like strong CS background with programming gets you most of the way there, and then you can study the like OWASP top 10 and vulnerabilities after that, and they'll make sense pretty quickly if you understand how things are built. There was another one up here first, but then I'll come over to you.
The book you mentioned, the hackers.
Oh, did I? How did I just change this? There we go.
Does it still hold up, or does it get updated every year?
There's a new one, isn't there?
Version
Handbook
2 is out.
Version 2 has been out for a while, but now they also have a bunch of training material on the web. It was actually written by the guy who wrote Burp Suite, which is like the primary tool we use in web application hacking. And so there are a bunch of good training exercises on Portswigger's website. That are, what's that?
What was it again?
Portswigger is the online handle of David Studdard, the guy that wrote the Web Application Hackers Handbook and Burp Suite.
Mike, I did bring the resource guide.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff in the book, you still
Other
see it
people
today.
want
Like, these security issues have not gone away. Like, the book has been out for maybe 5 or 6 years, and I still see all this stuff on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So, the
It's-
content's there.
Elements of how you go about testing have changed because of the language and frameworks, but yeah, the vulnerabilities are all still the same stuff.
When you guys run a pen test for a client, what metric is used to determine the success of it? Like, if you guys find nothing, is it still a successful pen test? Is there like a metric, like so many bugs or vulnerabilities exploited per service, or?
That's a complicated, so his question, if anybody couldn't hear it, is what is the measurement of success of when we do a penetration test for a
How
client?
does like the client find value in hiring you guys to do a pen test?
So back to an earlier point, they hire us for different reasons for different people. So it depends on what they're looking for how they will determine it as success. So we were a part of this Google Partners program where people who wrote apps that interface with Google's APIs and things, they need Google requires that they get vetted in order to do that. So all of those app writers are motivated specifically to get a letter that says I've gotten a security assessment. So for them, having it done without findings in it is their version of success. That's not ours personally, because we want to find all the problems that are there. The motivations can get kind of dodgy sometimes, where if you were being kind of pressured into receiving a security test, it becomes that organization's motivation for vulnerabilities not to be found. And there's that gets awkward during the engagement sometimes, where you find that those clients are less helpful because they don't want to give you all of the information. You're like, well, why do you need credentials to log into the website? A real hacker wouldn't have those. Just poke at the login form and see what happens. And that's not a real assessment of your application. But and then there are other ones that they have their own genuine interest in it and they want to know what's there. So a lot of in terms of how do we wrap up and feel good about it, all of that, one, at the beginning, we'll establish particular goals with them. Different people want different things out of it, besides the voluntary and involuntary forms of it. There's also, some of them just have a particular target. There's one major concern we have. We have a piece of sensitive content. We do not want that piece of content exposed. Any other vulnerabilities we don't care about that much. That's not a win. But if you can show that you can get to that piece of sensitive content, that's what we care about. Some people just want to know, we just want to know about as many vulnerabilities as you got. And some people feel like they were good and are totally happy if we find nothing. They go like, yeah, we thought we were secure, thanks for proving it. And other people get suspicious and say, hey, I ran an automated tool and it found 300 things. How come you didn't find anything? And then we have to explain that. So a lot of that is communication during the process. And that's where some of the checklist things and actual communication about what we did goes into it. We've had issues where we delivered a no findings report and the client was mad and said, we paid you thousands of dollars to do this test. You didn't find anything. What the heck? And so in one case, we went and we did it again. We got different people. We picked even more senior people and we said, we'll redo the test. We want to make sure that you get good value out of it. We'll redo it. And the second group that redid it, was just significantly more communicative with the client. Like every day, they're like, this is what I'm doing. I'm testing this right now. This is what I'm looking for. This is what I'm doing. And it turned out in that second engagement, still found nothing. But at the end of that one, the client was actually totally happy with us because they understood everything that went into it up to that point, and they were convinced that we had done all of the appropriate coverage of it. And they said, oh, this is actually good news then. We just paid for the secure feeling of knowing that we had experienced expert pen testers comb through everything in detail and they didn't find anything wrong. That's actually the goal state for anybody, right? But you need to communicate sufficiently to convince them that that is what they got versus, hey, I paid thousands of dollars in a report with nothing in it. That's a real disappointment.
Another question.
Sort of going off what you said, do you have any issues with liability after doing like consultations? If, per se, you deliver a report that says, oh, there isn't a problem and some problem arises, sometime down the line, or if they hire another firm and then they find something that, you guys didn't, or vice versa, and do they, or any clients ever like angry or want money back after a consultation if it was different than another's?
Sure. They could be upset in cases where that happens. In terms of the liability thing, to be clear, it's impossible in any case to prove the total security of something. So we never make a claim that that's what we've done. The reports are very clear. Like, this was a time-bound assessment. Like, we only had a certain window of time to look at your systems. We did the best that we could to find problems. This is all we saw. We're not saying that's all there is. We're saying that that's all we could find within the time frame of this assessment. And so that's all we're making claim to. And so the other document that we will provide people is a letter of assessment that says, we as security experts did our best to test the system, and this is what we got out of it. And that's as far as any of the language goes. We're very specific in the language from a legal perspective to not say, this is exactly how many vulnerabilities you have. We would not make that claim for anybody. But we would say, we did our best within this time window and these restrictions, and this is what came out of it.
Is there any direct generation of 0 days within a pen test, or is it only non-vulnerabilities that you
Well, so when we're talking about application testing, in a way they're all 0 days as far as the client's application under test. They're not known vulnerabilities in the client's web application at that point until we've found them. Sometimes there are overlaps with third-party products that they're using, and we've come up with 0 days for other things during the assessment, and then there's a bunch of kind of legal coordination for who owns what, and then when we're allowed to talk about it and things like that. So we'll go, okay, we were testing your systems and we found this hole in software that somebody else wrote. We would like to get credit for that and tell the world that we found this cool thing because that looks good for our business. But since it's in your system and it was achieved during the work that you paid for, we need to first sort it out with the client, and then once it's cool with them, sort it out with the vendor who wrote that vulnerable software, and then we may do a disclosure after that's been taken care of.
So how often do you guys test yourselves, or do you test yourselves, or do you get a third party to do that?
We do test ourselves. That's we don't have a ton of externally facing things. We have a WordPress blog is our website, and there's not a lot of other like externally facing Bishop Fox stuff to go after in that sense, but we do test that as well as the other services that we use internally.
If we were sitting in an interview, what's the most valuable thing that I could say to you?
Am I talking to him soon? What's the most valuable thing you could say in an interview?
You just got it.
Kind of related to how I answered an earlier question, demonstrated app skills are really attractive to me personally. So just in terms of the balance of work that we do, it's heavily leaned towards web applications. So we do other things, but more than 60% of our work is web application assessment. So having a really good application understanding is, it's hard to find and get. There are people that are interested in security, but then when you show them source code or you want to take apart how an application is constructed and they can't do that, that opens up a lot of misses that you're going to have in terms of the vulnerabilities that you can discover if you can't do that. So really strong app skills, a demonstration of strong app skills is the thing that gets me the most excited, combined with then enthusiasm for security. So sometimes we do get curious people that go, I have really strong app skills, but I don't know that I'm that into security. And that kills it for me a little bit because it requires that commitment. And nobody coming in, even relatively senior people, can know everything that you're going to need to know to be successful on the job. So also like a demonstration of like passion for continued learning. You don't know enough. I don't know enough. Nobody in here does. You're going to have to learn more regardless of where you're at. And so evidence that will be true also, that, okay, whatever level you're at now, like give me reason to believe that you're going to be at a higher level soon. and that's what I would want to see.
I brought some stickers, and if anybody wants them, I'll put them out. And then for people who are maybe asking about some of the basic resources, like the books and things he was mentioning, we have a printout, and a lot of those are listed on there. A lot of the things on there I think that you guys already get into and cover in DevilSec. So if you're new to DevilSec, they can probably actually walk you through a lot of these resources and meetings, but I'm still gonna, still feel free to take the guide.
Sweet. So we're going to wrap it up. If you guys want to network, socialize, feel free to. We have the room till like 7:30. If you want to talk to them, come on up, talk to them, chat.
I'm not staying till 7:30 though.